Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how to use lifting equipment during training for the goal of muscle hypertrophy. Before we get into the details of how to use lifting equipment for hypertrophy training, let's first understand what the goal of training is when trying to maximize muscle growth. Essentially, the goal of training is to maximally stress the target muscle. We aren't trying to lift as much weight as possible, and we aren't trying to have transfer to other sports. The goal is simply to stress the muscle tissue. This is because muscle growth is a structural adaptation, not a performance outcome. This is important to consider when we discuss the use of lifting equipment later in this video. So basically, there are two primary factors we should consider when implementing exercises for hypertrophy. These are stimulus and fatigue. Let's now briefly cover what these mean and how they relate to hypertrophy training. Stimulus refers to how well the exercise stimulates muscle hypertrophy. There are numerous factors which influence the hypertrophic stimulus of an exercise, such as movement biomechanics, range of motion, and tension curves. We won't go into detail about how these factors influence hypertrophy, but ultimately stimulus refers to how well the exercise trains the target muscle. So with every exercise we implement, we want to maximize the stimulus side of the equation. The other factor to consider regarding hypertrophy training is fatigue. When we train, we not only provide a stimulus, but we also induce fatigue. This refers to both local fatigue of specific joints and connective tissue, and also overall systemic fatigue. While we want to maximize the hypertrophic stimulus of each exercise, we simultaneously want to minimize fatigue. This means we want to minimize stress on the joints and connective tissue, and minimize systemic fatigue cost. While we won't go into detail about how to achieve this, we will now explore how lifting equipment may influence the hypertrophic stimulus of an exercise and the fatigue cost. So what exactly is lifting equipment? For this video, we will be referring to lifting equipment as accessory gear that is worn during lifting, which is primarily manufactured for the purpose of improving lifting performance. Some examples of lifting equipment include belts, knee sleeves, and weightlifting shoes. Let's now cover what benefits and negatives lifting gear can have specifically for hypertrophy training. For the most part, lifting gear is designed to help us lift more weight. This is usually through direct assistance with the lift or by increasing stability of specific joints. If we want to maximize strength, relevant lifting equipment is going to be helpful in almost all cases because it allows us to lift more weight. However, for hypertrophy training, we aren't necessarily concerned with lifting the most weight possible, we are concerned with stressing the muscle as much as possible. Therefore, lifting equipment may provide a benefit in some cases by helping us to do so. It can be useful in some cases by stabilizing or strengthening certain joints that aren't involved with the prime movers of the lift. This way we can reduce stress on these joints and tissues and distribute more stress on the muscle we are trying to train. So in a sense, lifting equipment in some cases can increase the likelihood of making the target muscle the limiting factor. However, lifting equipment can also have some negative effects for hypertrophy training. As we know, lifting equipment generally has the goal of improving lifting performance. If equipment is used to simply lift more total weight by assisting the prime movers, then this may not be the best strategy. This will simply reduce or at best maintain stress on the target muscle because it is not necessarily performing any more work than it previously was, it is just being assisted by equipment. Furthermore, there will be more local fatigue of the relevant joints and more systemic fatigue with each set because you are using a heavier load. Now that we have covered the theoretical reasons in favor and against using lifting equipment, let's now cover specific types of equipment and how they may impact hypertrophy training. The first piece of equipment we will cover is lifting belts. Lifting belts are basically a piece of material, usually made of some sort of fabric or leather, that is secured around the waist while lifting. They provide 360-degree support around the abdominals, obliques, and lower back, which helps trainees brace their trunk and provides greater stability. This allows greater intra-abdominal pressure and a more rigid trunk, which minimizes movement of the spine under load while lifting. Belts are usually worn during exercises like squats and deadlifts, where trunk stability is highly important. Lifting belts are generally a very useful piece of equipment for hypertrophy training. This is because they allow greater trunk stability, which minimizes potential for the trunk muscles to limit performance. In turn, this allows more stress to be distributed to the muscles we are trying to train. For example, trainees may use a lifting belt during squats to increase trunk stability and focus more tension on the quads. However, we should also be aware that a lifting belt shouldn't be used simply for the sake of being able to lift a heavier load. You don't want to use equipment or deviate your form just to lift more weight unless your goal is to maximize strength. When lifting for hypertrophy, the loads used are likely going to be lighter than when training for strength, so you shouldn't really need to rely on a belt to lift well. The belt will just add a small amount of stability to help maximize tension on the target muscle. Therefore, for hypertrophy training, a light and thin fabric belt that is easy to take on and off is probably the best option. Next, let's discuss the use of knee sleeves. Knee sleeves are an elastic sleeve that covers the knee joint. They are worn primarily for squats and sometimes for other squatting type movements like leg presses and hack squats. During squats, the knee sleeves stretch and provide an elastic recoil that basically acts to provide more knee extension force in the bottom range. The material also compresses and bunches together at the back of the knee, which also provides an elastic bounce to help at the bottom range of a squat. Therefore, trainees can usually lift slightly more weight with knee sleeves than without them. There are also different knee sleeve thicknesses, which will influence how much benefit they provide. Generally, a thicker sleeve provides more assistance, and a thinner sleeve provides less assistance. Knee sleeves are generally not a useful piece of equipment for hypertrophy training. This is because they allow trainees to lift more weight by essentially assisting the quads. This stress on the quads is also alleviated in the bottom range of the squat, which is potentially the most hypertrophic portion of the lift because the quads are in the most stretched position. So the quads end up doing less or at best the same amount of work, and it provides more systemic stress to the body and local stress on the spine. However, a case could be made for some individuals that knee sleeves also reduce joint stress on the knees. This is probably true as the knee sleeves may limit tension on the elastic tendons like the patella and quadriceps tendons. If trainees have an injury history or predisposition which results in pain at the bottom range of a squat, knee sleeves may be a viable option. While this may not be ideal, it is better than squatting with pain. In this case, trainees should find the thinnest possible sleeve which allows them to train pain-free and gradually try to transition to training without knee sleeves to build joint tolerance. Next, we have elbow sleeves. Elbow sleeves are essentially the exact same product as knee sleeves, although they are placed on the elbows rather than the knees. The concept here is exactly the same as knee sleeves, so we won't cover this in too much detail. Basically, elbow sleeves are probably not very useful for hypertrophy training because they allow more weight to be lifted and reduce tension on the triceps during pressing exercises. Therefore, tricep stimulus is reduced and heavier loads are used, which means more stress on the shoulders and more total systemic fatigue. However, similar to the case with knee sleeves, if trainees have a predisposition or injury that results in elbow pain, sleeves may be a way to train pain-free. Once again, in this case, trainees should use the thinnest possible sleeves that allow them to train pain-free and try to gradually transition to lifting without an elbow sleeve. Next, let's discuss the use of wrist wraps. Wrist wraps, not to be mistaken by wrist straps, are an elastic or cotton fabric that wraps around the wrist joint. Similar to a lifting belt, wrist wraps provide wrist stability, which minimizes movement of the joint. Wrist wraps are generally used during pressing exercises to limit movement of the wrist, allowing more force transfer into the barbell or dumbbell. This may help lift slightly more weight in pressing movements, but it probably won't make too much of a difference. Wrist wraps could potentially be a useful piece of equipment for hypertrophy training. During pressing exercises, we aren't trying to train the wrist, we are generally trying to train the chest or shoulders primarily. So rather than losing force through wrist movement, wrist wraps may help to distribute more tension on the target muscles. So we may be able to get a slightly better stimulus for the chest or shoulders. However, wrist wraps probably aren't going to make a significant difference for hypertrophy training. Since the loads used are not going to be maximal like they would with strength training, it is unlikely for wrist stability to have much impact on lifting mechanics. Furthermore, wrist wraps can be inconvenient to take on and off with each set. Therefore, if wrist wraps are going to be used, a thin and light wrist wrap is recommended that is quick and easy to tighten and loosen. The next piece of equipment we have is straps. There are many different types of lifting straps, but they all loop around your wrist and then wrap around the bar, dumbbell, or attachment. This essentially secures your wrist to the piece of equipment you are using, making your grip much stronger. Straps are usually used for any horizontal rows, vertical pulls, deadlift variations, or any other lift where grip strength is required. Out of all the pieces of equipment in this video, straps are the cheapest and probably the most useful for hypertrophy training. For relevant exercises, straps basically ensure grip doesn't limit performance in any way or inhibit movement quality. This allows us to distribute more tension on the target muscles, as grip strength won't get in the way. For example, straps can be used during an exercise like a seated cable row to ensure technique is on point and so that the back muscles limit performance before grip gives out. A common argument against wearing straps is that it may inhibit forearm development or grip strength. However, this is probably not going to be the case for a number of reasons. Firstly, although grip may be required for certain strength lifts, it is not required for hypertrophy-oriented goals. In terms of forearm development, straps probably won't inhibit progress much at all. This is because trainees must still grip the implement, so the forearms are still required to work. Furthermore, most of the forearm muscles originate on the humerus, which means they act on the elbow joint as well as the wrist. Therefore, these muscles will be involved and indirectly developed through pushing exercises, pulling exercises, bicep training, and tricep training, regardless of the action at the wrist. And if the forearms are a lagging body part for someone, you can always train them with more volume by performing direct forearm work. And the last piece of equipment we have is weightlifting shoes. Weightlifting shoes are shoes originally made for the sport of Olympic weightlifting. They have a very flat and solid base, and a raised heel which can be different heights based on the shoe model and manufacturer. This makes them extremely stable to lift with, places the ankle in a more plantar flexed position, and shifts the trainee's center of mass slightly forward. Weightlifting shoes can be beneficial for hypertrophy training for exercises like squats, lunges, leg presses, and other leg exercises which require foot stability. Weightlifting shoes provide stability by maximizing surface area on the ground and providing a hard sole so that there is minimal movement of the shoe and foot while lifting. Furthermore, the raised heel generally allows trainees to squat slightly deeper and with a more upright torso position, which distributes more stress to the quads and less to the hips. This provides trainees with a greater quad stimulus and minimizes leaked energy through unnecessary foot movement. So with all this information in mind, let's establish some practical recommendations. Firstly, we should understand that lifting equipment probably doesn't make hypertrophy training significantly more effective. It may provide a slight benefit in some cases that can help you induce a greater hypertrophic stimulus to a specific muscle group. However, in other cases, it may just help you lift more weight with no real benefit. In this case, the equipment will just cause you additional fatigue and is not recommended. Furthermore, implementation of different pieces of equipment can be context dependent in some cases. It may be that a trainee is using a certain piece of equipment to train pain-free because of an injury or predisposition. Therefore, trainees should only use lifting equipment if they see a benefit in doing so and are happy to buy it. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.